And we're going to, I know there are people in the room, but you're not really talking to them. We're going to be, it's the recording, so you need this. Don't worry, it's on. You just put it nearer you when you're speaking so that people... Hello? You can, is yours working?
Is it on? Yes.
Okay. Right. Welcome, everybody, and thank you very much to Irina, who's going to be interviewing David. And they know each other of old, so we are going to be hearing a very, hopefully, informal conversation, which will be able to touch on many different subjects. And ultimately, we're going to turn over to yourselves to ask questions. And David has very generously said, no holds barred. So by all means, share, but we'll start off with some introductory remarks, and Irina will take the floor. Thank you all very much.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us here in Davos on a very busy and sunny afternoon. We're very privileged to have David Rubenstein with us. He doesn't need a formal introduction to an audience like yours, but for those who are meeting David for the first time, David Rubenstein is co-founder and co-chairman of the Carlyle Group. He's also the chairman of the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the Smithsonian, the Council of Foreign Relations, and many more things which we hope to hear about later on. So let's start. So David, here in Davos, if you had a choice to have dinner with President Xi or President Putin?
As an alternative to having dinner with you, I'd rather have dinner with you.
So would I.
Okay.
So would I. Anytime, David.
Okay.
So would I.
But if
Who would you choose, and what would you ask him?
Well, I have met President Xi on a number of occasions, and the first time I met him, I remember distinctly saying, looking for something to say, I said, you know, there's an old Chinese proverb that says a trip of 1,000 miles begins with a first step. He said, no, that's an American fortune cookie statement. So I got off on the wrong footing. But I can say I met him on a number of occasions. I met with him recently in Beijing when there was a conference there. And I would say I've never met Putin. So I would be interested in having dinner with him. I've never heard him express an interest in having dinner with me, though. But I think he would be quite interesting. Remember, he's been running Russia for 20 years, and that's quite a long time. And the stories he could tell, I don't know whether he would tell them, but I think they'd be quite interesting.
Would you ask him something specific?
I would say, do you like this job as much as you thought you were going to like it? And what were you thinking on the morning of December 31, 1999, when you heard all of a sudden you're going to be the new president of Russia? Were you intimidated? Did you think that was going to be a job you'd have for 20 years? And what do you do for rest and relaxation?
At some point in the future, would you like to sit at this table as the President of the United States, as a Secretary of State, or as a Secretary of Commerce?
I'd rather be the chairman of YPO. That would be my highest calling. I started a firm many years ago. I've never been invited to be part of YPO. I've spoken at YPO events around the world, never been invited to be a president or chairman of YPO, so that would probably be my highest priority. But if I couldn't be the chairman or president of a YPO chapter, I think being president of the United States is nice, but there's no evidence that a private equity person is likely to get it. Now, it is my theory that private equity is the highest calling of mankind, and that it should be more respected. And it's also my theory that James Madison in the Constitutional Convention said, I want to make sure that carried interest taxation is preserved. And it just didn't get in the amendments to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So I would work to get it in the Constitution. That would be my highest calling, to try to get that done. If I couldn't do that, I wouldn't mind being Secretary of State. Jim Baker once told me, he was in our firm for a number of years, the presidency might be a higher sounding job, but the best job in Washington is being Secretary of State. And if you have a good relationship with the president, it is a great job. There's no doubt about it.
So we look forward to that.
Well, I have to remember, when I served in government, before all of you were probably born, I worked in the Carter at White House. I managed to get inflation to 19%. And nobody's managed to do that since. I told the president that, look, the Shah has some bad health. Let him in the country. What bad things could possibly happen? And I told him that, look, the hostages were taken, but in a week it'll be over. Actually, it was the administration that was over in a week, not the hostages. So there's been no call for me to go back into government service. However, Jay Powell used to work at Carlyle for 8 years. I hired him, for us for about 8 years. Very good buyout guy. And I've told him, if deflation ever becomes a problem and you need somebody that knows how to inflate the economy, bring me back into government.
So you may not want to be a politician, but you're a very successful investor and you're a very successful commentator. So this morning we heard President Trump telling us that he's best friend with President Xi. What do you think is next for U.S.-China relations?
Okay. To be very serious, I think that President Trump deserves some credit for getting a deal done. It's not the deal that ultimately people thought should get done. Some people wanted a phase 2 and phase 1 at the same time. That probably was unrealistic because we were asking the Chinese to do too many things that the Chinese weren't prepared to do. But I think phase 1 being done does one major thing. It lifts the cloud over the global trading environment. I think the U.S. economy, was slowing down a bit, and I think the global economy was slowing down a bit because of the tensions between China and the United States. And now that that is removed for some time a bit, I think it's a good thing. So I think it's a good thing that it got done, and it doesn't have to be approved by Congress. As you know, it's not like NAFTA or USMCA, so it's done.
You often mention that one should not denigrate patriotism. In your view, Trump's expression, Trump's phrase, "Make America Great Again," does it fall into your definition what it means to be a patriot?
Well, let me be clear what I mean. Patriots are people that try to do something for their country. It's an interesting phenomenon we have. Very few people say, I'm prepared to die for my neighborhood. I'm prepared to die for my street. I'm prepared to die for my state. But people are prepared to die for their country. Because the way the world civilization has evolved, people take a very strong attachment to their country. And a patriot is somebody who believes that it is important to support and help that country do a better job in many different ways. You can do it in the military services, and you can do it through philanthropy, you can do it through volunteerism, a lot of different ways you can be a patriot. Unfortunately, in recent years, I would say the right side of the political spectrum has identified patriotism as their preserve, and people on the left side have been seen as not being as patriotic. And I think it's unfortunate because people on the right and people on the left can be patriotic. A lot of people who have left-leaning views might be great military soldiers or people who have given their life to their country. So I just think the word patriotism has been bastardized a bit by some people, unfortunately. In terms of President Trump's slogan, everybody who runs for president has a slogan. That's what you need to do to run for president. And he came up with one that offended some people, but obviously seemed to have worked, and it seems to really excite his people.
So speaking of upcoming elections, Bloomberg is not very tall. He's not as handsome as you are, David. Do you think he has chance against tall and glamorous Donald?
Well, remember, I told Jimmy Carter in 1980, you're going to get reelected. I was wrong. I told Al Gore, you're going to be elected president. I was wrong. I told George W. Bush, you have no chance of being elected president. I was wrong. I told John Kerry, you're going to be president. I was wrong. So my views are generally not dispositive of what's going to happen. In this case, I should disclose that I told Donald Trump he would not be president as well. He came to the Economic Club of Washington in December of 2015. He told me he was going to run for president. I said, President what? He said, President of the United States. I said, Donald, you have no chance of being elected, but I was wrong. And so my predictions are just generally not generally the kind of things that people should rely on. Today, I would say this. If you predict who the President of the United States is going to be, roughly, let's say, 8-9 months before the election, you're almost certainly going to be wrong. You wouldn't have predicted 9 months in advance Barack Obama, Jimmy Carter, John Kennedy, Donald Trump. So it's just too early to say. It's fun to talk about it, but it's too early to know for certain. If I had to bet today, I would say it is more likely than not that Donald Trump will be reelected for these reasons. Number one, presidents of the United States who run for reelection when the economy is good and not in recession get reelected. If you run for reelection when you have a recession, you usually lose. So Jimmy Carter, George Herbert Walker Bush, and Gerald Ford lost recessions. Strong economy, you get reelected. Second, there's a predisposition in the United States to vote for the incumbent official, and therefore he has that benefit as well. And the economy right now is very, very strong in the United States. Third or fourth point is there's an old saying in politics, you can't beat somebody with nobody. So who is going to beat him? So you have to find somebody. Now, I can go through each of the candidates. Each have their pluses and minuses.
Please, we'd love to hear that.
Well, Bernie Sanders, I think it's unlikely that the United States will elect a 78-year-old man who just had a heart attack and who's identified as a socialist for most of his life. I could be wrong, but I think it's unlikely he'd be elected president of the United States. I think it's difficult to think that somebody that isn't that well known, Mayor Pete, he's not even a mayor anymore, and he's only 37 years old. In the year 2060, he'll still be younger than Bernie Sanders is today. So think about that. And so I think he's very young. Joe Biden, as his slogan, if I were recommending his slogan, I know him, I like him, it would be, if first you don't succeed, try again and again and again and again. And it might work. Sometimes people can try many different times. Ronald Reagan ran for president twice before he actually got elected. So it could be that Biden could pull it off. He probably is a very strong candidate if he could get the nomination. If Mike Bloomberg could get the nomination, I think he would be a compelling candidate because he's got unlimited money, unlimited amount of money, and he will spend it. So he would be compelling. In our country, for those who don't focus on this, and no reason you should, when John Kennedy ran for president against Richard Nixon in 1960, Richard Nixon campaigned in all 50 states. John Kennedy campaigned in about 45 states because they didn't know which way states would go. He wasn't clear in those days. Now we know how every state's going to go. So if you were the Democratic candidate, you're going to win California. It doesn't make a difference what you say, what you do. If you're a Republican, you're going to win, let's say, Alabama. Doesn't make a difference what you say or who you are. So there are very few states that matter. There are only about 8 or 9 states that are up for grabs. And in those states right now, Trump is doing reasonably well. Those states are North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, Colorado, New Mexico. Those states are ones where he has a fair amount of support, whether you might like that or not. So I think it's going to be too early to say, and we'll have to figure out, how the impeachment thing goes. But most people think that will be behind everybody in a month or so.
Of course, it's very difficult to predict politics, but you're highly skilled in predicting.
Well, I got everything wrong mostly, but okay.
Well, you're highly skilled in predicting
Okay.
winners in your
All right.
in your other job. How do you assess young people who want to work for you? What
Okay.
skills are you looking for? What specific qualities you're looking for?
When I'm hiring people, these are the skills that I'm looking for. One, reasonable intelligence. I don't think a genius is good because it's hard to manage geniuses. I've managed geniuses and not well. They're hard to manage. So I don't want a genius. Reasonable intelligence. 2, willingness to work hard. I mean, you can't do anything great 9 to 5, 5 days a week. Nobody won a Nobel Prize 5 days a week, 9 to 5. You have to really, work harder. 3, you have to learn how to persuade people. And you do it by one of 3 ways. Learn how to talk orally, master oral communications, persuading people. By writing, learning how to write very well. Or you learn by example, show people by example. You do something and people follow you. So I'm looking for people that want to be leaders and want to persuade people how to follow them because I want to hire leaders. I'm also looking for people that like to exercise their brain. 30% of the people in the United States who graduate from college never read another book in the rest of their life. And that's because they just think they got their degree, they don't need to read again. You have to keep exercising your brain. And if you keep learning more and learning more, you have enough knowledge that you can be very helpful and you can succeed. So I want people that are intellectually curious. I'm also looking for people that know what to do with success when they get it. Not just to get more artwork and houses and boats, but do something useful for society by giving back to society in some ways. I'm also looking for people that have a high degree of integrity. And I think that's very important. And last, I'd say, know how to share the credit. Nobody can do anything in this world by himself. Even Albert Einstein's E equals MC squared, he had to convince people eventually that he was right. You need other people. And Ronald Reagan famously said, there is no limit to what humans can accomplish if they're willing to share the credit. So I'm looking for people that are willing to say we as opposed to I all the time. So I've made hiring mistakes. I've hired thousands of people. Sometimes I've not hired people I should have hired. Sometimes I hired people I shouldn't have hired. But generally, those are the things I look for.
Well, great to know. Hopefully the application process is open. But you, you have been in private equity since 87. And
1887. 1887. Or 1987. Okay, yeah, it's been a long time.
1987.
Right.
It's still a long time,
Right.
but 1987. After all this time, what keeps you engaged in this crowded industry? How do you keep up with all the economic and geopolitical challenges?
Well, when you get to be in an industry for a long time, you tend to have more knowledge because you have more experience. So the real question is, why am I still doing this? My observation is this. I was, for many years, the youngest person in the room. When I worked in the White House, I was 27 years old. So I was one of the youngest people in the room. Gradually, and many of you had this experience, you're very young, and gradually you get a little bit older and a little bit older. And so when you have your 50th birthday party, everybody's happy. They pat you on the back because they say you got 50 down and you got 50 to go. You can pretend you're going to get to 100. When you get to 60, you know you've lived more than you're going to live. And so you begin to think about doing some other things before the inevitable happens. When you turn 70, people say, you're breathing still? You can put your pants on in the morning? Anybody help you get dressed? So people look at you differently, and what they're saying is, you don't have that much more time, so if you're going to keep working, you're not going to have time to do all the things on your bucket list. So you do look at things differently. But the truth is, when you build something from scratch, it's not unlike creating a child. Obviously, a child is a human being. It's different. But when you create a child, and you're a mother, you feel great paternal or maternal pride in that, and you want that child to succeed and have a happy and healthy life and hopefully produce grandchildren at some point, right? Well, when you start a company, you feel the same way. You want that to be successful, and since I started Carlyle, it was my idea. I want it to be successful so that at my eulogy, people will say, well, he started this company and it went pretty well. I don't want people to say, well, he started this company, but it went terrible, and now we're glad he's in the ground because it's gone anyway. The company wasn't so good. You want people to think good things about you so that your children and your grandchildren will think you did something useful with your life, not just by starting a company, but doing the other things you can do by starting a company, getting the benefit of financial success, and then doing other more useful things than just buying things.
Well, so let's speak about philanthropy, more useful things than buying. You have given away hundreds of millions of dollars. You were one of the first ones to sign the Giving Pledge. At what point in your life you became passionate about patriotic philanthropy? You coined that phrase.
Okay.
We'd love to hear about it.
Let me describe this. I built Carlyle, and it was pretty successful, but I was focused on much of my time of building it. Then in my early 50s, Forbes magazine said, Rubenstein has a net worth of X. It's very high. And, my kids said, Dad, is that true? And, a lot of my relatives called up and said, hey, is that true? And people I went to high school said, hey, is that true? And I had to ask my accountant, is that true? But it's true. I did have a fairly high net worth by normal human standards, but somebody that has a high net worth by much higher standards came to have lunch with me in my office. That was Bill Gates, and he said he was going to start the Giving Pledge, where you give away half your money upon your death or during your lifetime. And I said I would do that because actually I came from very modest circumstances. My parents weren't college graduates. They weren't high school graduates. I grew up in a very modest environment, and I now, because of good luck, have this incredible fortune, and I decided I would want to give it back largely to my country. And I coined the phrase patriotic philanthropy to describe one type of philanthropy. 95% of my money goes to typical things: education, scholarships, medical research, health, things like that, which people often do, and other cultural things, performing arts and other kinds of cultural things. But about 5% goes to things where I'm trying to remind people of the history and heritage of our country. And the reason that's important is this. There's a famous Harvard philosopher who once said, George Santayana, those people that don't remember history are condemned to relive it. So if you don't remember the mistakes of the past, you might make those mistakes again. So I try to remind people of our history, and it's sad because right now we don't teach civics and history very much in the United States anymore. So 3/4 of Americans in a recent survey could not name the three branches of government. 3/4 could not name the three branches of government. 10% of American college graduates recently said Judge Judy is a member of the United States Supreme Court. which I like to say is not yet the case. And then think about this, naturalized Americans. To be a naturalized American, you have to take a citizenship test after 5 years of residency. There are 100 potential questions. You're given 10. You have to pass 6 of the 10. 91% of the people pass that who take it. The same test was given to native-born citizens recently in all 50 states, and in only one state, Vermont, could a majority of citizens pass that test. So I think one of my passions is trying to educate people about history and our heritage, the good and the bad. So toward that end, I bought the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, the Emancipation Proclamation, put them in places people could see them, learn more about history, or fixed the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, Jefferson Memorial, Mount Vernon, Monticello, and so forth, so people could go there and learn more. So that's what I regard as patriotic philanthropy, giving back to your country. But I remind people also that philanthropy is an ancient Greek word that's derivative of a word that means loving humanity. It doesn't mean rich people writing checks. So you can love humanity and be a philanthropist by giving your time, your energy, and your ideas. And the most valuable thing you can give is your time. You can always make more money if you're inclined to do so, but you can never make more time. And so I encourage people that don't have staggering amounts of money, give your time. That can be very valuable, and that's philanthropic too.
Your recent book, American Story, tell us
Okay.
about it.
Well, I had a theory that not only should Americans know more about our history, but members of Congress should too. So I started a program 6 years ago to educate members of Congress a little bit more about American history since they're making the laws. And once a month for 6 years, I have the great American historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, or David McCullough, John Meacham, Robert Caro, Ron Chernow, come in and I interview them at the Library of Congress in front of only members of Congress and their guests. And members like it a lot. They call it date night. They bring their spouses or their girlfriends or whatever they want to bring. And they really enjoy it because it's a nice free dinner. They can learn about somebody. I interview them for about an hour, and they can ask questions as well. And then I took the best 18 of them and put them in a book called The American Story, so people could read the edited transcripts. I'll tell you one anecdote about it. In addition to the historians I interviewed about great presidents and people who are great Americans like Charles Lindbergh, I interviewed the Chief Justice of the United States, and I'm the chairman of the Smithsonian. He's the chancellor, so I get to work with him fairly frequently, and I know him. And you know you're old when you're older than the Chief Justice of the United States. I always looked up to the Chief Justice. Now I'm older than the Chief Justice. But anyway, this Chief Justice, I interviewed him because I thought members of Congress should know more about how the court works, even though their offices are nearby, they don't know as much. So I began by saying, Mr. Chief Justice, did you always want to be, when you were a little boy, Chief Justice of the United States? And he said, well, actually I didn't. Well, did you want to be an Associate Justice of the United States? Well, actually I didn't. Well, did you want to be a judge of any type? Well, actually I didn't. Well, did you want to be a lawyer even? Actually, I didn't. Well, what did you want to be? I wanted to be a historian. All I cared about was American history. And my father said, John, there's no money in history. People will not read your books. You'll starve to death. How are you going to support a family? And little John said, I don't care. All I want to do is be a historian. So eventually he did well in school, went to Harvard, comes back from spring break, gets off at the Logan Airport in Boston, gets into a cab, and says to the cab driver, can you take me to Cambridge? And the cab driver said, are you a student at Harvard? Yes, I am. What are you majoring in? I'm majoring in history. Cab driver said, well, when I was a student at Harvard, that's what I majored in also. So little John decided to go to law school.
Will you write an autobiography like some of your peers?
I have a couple books coming. I have another book coming out in September. I have a TV show on Bloomberg. It's called Peer to Peer. I didn't really think, it's actually called the David Rubenstein Show, Peer to Peer. Now, when they came up with this idea, I said, look, a long ethnic name like Rubenstein isn't going to work on a TV show. And Mike Bloomberg said, no, I think it'll work out. So he didn't think it was a problem. So we called it that, and I've now done, about 100 of them. I've taken 50 of them and put them, and I've distilled the interviews, and in a book on leadership, how to be a leader, it'll be coming out in September, and it's basically interviews with Jim Baker, Colin Powell, David Petraeus, Ginny Rometty, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, people like that, great leaders in business or in the arts, Yo-Yo Ma or Renee Fleming. So then after that book, I have probably another history book coming out, and then maybe a patriotic philanthropy book. So the trick is, this is the crazy thing. I'm now 70 years old. I took me 70 years to get my first book out. Now I'm rushing to get one out a year. And where was I in my 50s and 60s? Why didn't I get these books out? But now I'm rushing to get them out before the brain gives away or the heart collapses. I don't, you never know which thing is going to collapse first. And as you get older, you always say to yourself, okay, I got this body, and these parts have been part of my body my whole life. Which of these things is going to say, I'm out of here? Which thing is going to say, I'm not really ready to keep going on? You never know. So I try to keep every part in reasonable shape, but you never know, something can collapse. So I'm trying to get all these things done. So I don't do what most people who turn 70 doing, which is go play shuffleboard in Florida. I am doing what I call sprinting to the finish line. I am racing to get as much stuff done before the brain collapses or the body collapses.
Well, looking at you, I think you have a long way to go.
Well, I don't know. One thing I
But-
find, though, that may be helpful. See, my hair is actually pitch dark. If I dye it gray, people think I'm more mature that way, but I don't know whether that works.
Now that way people
That works,
respect
yeah.
you
Right,
more.
that's what I think.
You're looking for more respect. But let's go back to your famous show,
Okay.
David Rubenstein show, which airs on Bloomberg and on PBS. You mentioned all these super famous people, and you get them to open up in front of
Right.
you so easily. What's your secret as an interviewer?
Well, a couple things. One, I do prepare, as you have obviously done. Preparing is important because if you know something about the subject you're interviewing, it can be helpful. Secondly, I'm not a journalist, and so I don't scare people that much because journalists, the people who are being interviewed are always afraid you're trying to make them look bad or make them say something they don't want to say. So I tell them, look, I'm not a journalist. I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to get your story out. As you do, I listen to what they say. The trick is not just having questions in your brain, which I try to do, but when you have to listen to what the person says. You know, when the FBI comes along and says to me, we want to do a background check on somebody, they have a list of questions. You could say, this person's actually an axe murderer, but they go on to the next question. They don't listen to what you say. They just write it down and they go on to the next question. They got their 10, prescribed questions. You have to listen to what the person says and then divert from what you're otherwise going to talk to, and then let people talk about their background and what enabled them to rise up. Because everybody likes to talk about their favorite subject, which is themselves. The most common used word in the English language is I. And so people like to talk about themselves, as you obviously see in interviewing me. So I like to let people talk about how they came from where they came. And it's amazing. Some people you think are superstars when they were little people, little boys, little girls. They were not. And some people came later in life to success. Some people were very successful early on, but that's not generally the case. Generally, you find the people that are the superstars later in life were not the superstars earlier. And the way I divide it is you divide life into three parts. First third, you're getting your education, early training. Second third, you're getting ready to really be a professional in one area or another, and you really make a mark for yourself. And the third is when you're getting the benefits of that. You either get financial or psychic or professional rewards and get other kinds of things relating to near retirement or post-retirement. Okay, so very often the people who are the Rhodes Scholars, the White House Fellows, the Supreme Court clerks, the president of student governments, captains of the football team, they, after the first third, they kind of say, I don't need to work so hard because I'm already a superstar. And then so the people like me who aren't so talented, we come along and we're like the tortoise and the tortoise and the hare. We're coming along and they're superstars and we're passing them by because in the second third of life they don't work as hard. So I often don't like to hire the superstars because they are already preening so much about how great they are, they don't have to work so hard. I'm often looking for people who, are still working and trying harder because in the end, they're people who are going to be the most successful in life.
Well, very inspiring for us in the second
We'll see.
part of our life, a third part of our life. So this is before we open up the floor for some fun questions, can you give us a funny anecdote behind the scenes of the David Rubenstein show?
Well, there's always funny anecdotes. There's a very famous person. I won't out this very famous person, but we were taping the show, and the famous person was doing the interview, and the famous person was doing a good job. And then the producer ran in about 2/3 into the show and said, "Uh-oh, we got to tape it all over again." Why? Well, this famous person had kale salad for lunch, and it was on the front teeth, the kale, where they was coming on TV. So I said, look, we're not going to redo this with this famous person. This famous person is going to be out of here. So we got some electronic device to get the kale out. But generally, I find that people are easy to work with. The hardest part is just getting them comfortable that I'm not going to do anything that's going to embarrass them. I'm not trying to embarrass people. That's not my job. There may be journalists that try to do that, but that's not my job. Now, my toughest job in the next couple of days, we've talked about this, is that in Washington, there's something called the Alfalfa Club. And this has been going on for 100 years, where the President of the United States usually comes, sometimes he doesn't, Chief Justice comes, Cabinet comes, White House staff, leading CEOs, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Jamie Dimon, and so forth, come, and you make fun of each other and a lot of, humor. And this year, I'm the president, so my job is to get up and make fun of a lot of people. But, I'm afraid I might have to go into the witness protection program because, you make jokes about certain people and they're not so happy. So I'm trying to figure out how I can make jokes about people and not offend them. Not that easy.
Well, you seem to be doing a good job. So, David, thank you so much for doing it.
My pleasure, and thank you. And, I think you should get your own TV show.
I hope to get a job at yours.
Okay.
So I'm going to pass. Hello. So we're going to take some questions from the floor. I'm going to take the host's prerogative and ask you the first one.
Okay.
If I could turn your attention away from your landmass across the water to my own. We have a new Prime Minister with an incredible majority. So maybe our Prime Minister for the next 5-10 years, but you've negotiated a few deals in your life. He's got a fairly big one to negotiate. What's your take from your side of the Atlantic?
Well, I think when the Brexit vote first occurred, I think most Americans couldn't believe it actually happened, and many people thought it would be the point where Great Britain would become modest Britain because it wouldn't be able to compete in the global economy. It's only 3% of the world's GDP. Remember, for much of the 1800s, Great Britain ruled the world. And they, from this little island in the North Sea, not the most centrally located part on the globe, it really ruled the world, at least the Western world. Now it's not as significant, though still it's the 6th or 7th biggest economy in the world, still significant. But I think people in the United States, and I think people obviously in Britain, have now come to the conclusion that the world will not end, and Western world, as we know it, will not fall apart. And the British Empire, while not still around, will not completely fade if Britain does what it's about to do. So I think Boris has to focus on the terms he wants, get them negotiated. It's clearly he's got enough people in the parliament to get through anything he wants. He's got some leverage, therefore, negotiating with the EU. And I suspect that there's been discounting of it, so much so that I suspect when the deal comes through, the pound will probably rise against the dollar and against the euro a bit. So it's a different era, and nobody would have predicted this 100 years ago or even 50 years ago when Europe was coming together, but it's clearly going to happen now. I think the real issue is anybody else in Europe going to say, well, I've had enough too? And we don't know yet.
That's a fantastic answer. And I'll just one little follow-on. So our Prime Minister has asked me to help get entrepreneurs both in Britain and abroad to be more purposeful, more successful, and to come to our country and to do business. Objectively, do you think I have a hard job?
Well, I don't think so. I think you have the advantage of a good language that everybody in the world speaks, so that's a big plus. You have the rule of law, that's a big plus, and I own a piece of that. I own one of the 17 copies of the Magna Carta. There's 17 extant copies. I have the only one in private hands in the United States, and so the rule of law has been very important to England, and its traditions are very important. I think it's not the hardest place in the world in which to find good investments. My firm has invested there for 25 years or so, and we've been very happy with it. Some deals are better than others, but it's a pretty happy place for us to invest. So I would say, I don't think the Prime Minister should pay you so much for that job because it's probably pretty easy to do.
My name is Vladislava Magletska. I'm Vice President of Sigma Blazer Fund at Texas, Houston. We invest in a lot in emerging markets like Ukraine, Romania, Kazakhstan, and others. And actually, my question in regards to the recent awareness of IMF, Kristalina Grigoriev, Managing Director of IMF, She just said a couple of days ago that she's really aware about the world crisis upcoming or possibility of this. So what's your vision?
She's worried about world prices?
Yes.
I mean, the prices of the prices on of goods or so forth, thinks they're too high? Is that what the question was?
She was aware that crisis in upcoming years, crisis.
Oh, a crisis. We're a crisis.
Yes.
Well, if you're the head of the IMF or the World Bank and you say there are no crises, you have nothing to worry about. So there's nothing to do. So you'd be out of a job. I think, when you think back on it, Western world, let's just leave aside Asia for a moment. The Western world, and let's assume it's the United States and Canada and let's say Western Europe for these purposes. For hundreds of years, there were fights between all these parties, military fights, and we've largely eliminated that. So that crisis of going to military war in Europe is pretty much behind us, though obviously Russia is in Ukraine. But as a general rule, we have solved the military approach that's the approach that we have to use for everything. That's okay. The economy generally around the world is okay. It's not spectacular, but reasonably good. The IMF is now projecting, I think, global growth at about 3.3% for this coming year, down from 3.4%. Still, that's not too bad. We don't have any world wars ongoing right now. There's always tensions and there's always some war somewhere in the world. I don't think the world is in bad shape as it was in other times. So I think there's always things to deal with. But the biggest problems that I think the world has to face are overall, over the next 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25, and 30 years, climate change of some type. We have to deal with that issue because we only have one Earth, and in the end, if we ruin it, there's no place else to go. So that's number one. Number two, making sure the wealth is better spread to people around the globe. You have 7.5 billion people on the face of the Earth. About 1.5 to 2 billion of them don't even have internet access, let alone other kinds of things. And a lot of people are still living on $1 or $2 a day. So making sure income and distribution is better. I think making sure that technology is more readily available to people, not just in the Western world, but everywhere is an important thing. And also, I'd say trying to find ways that all people can be treated equally and with dignity. So it's not just white Western males of a certain age, but women and men and people of all ethnicities and backgrounds and so forth. So we have a long way to go. And I don't think all these problems are going to solve during my lifetime. But hopefully, we're beginning to make some progress. So I don't think the IMF, I don't think the problems are that great compared to what we've had in recent past, but there's some problems for sure.
My name is Kohli. I'm advisor to the government of Punjab in India. And we're looking at seeking investment in industry and manufacture. Do you see that now that American and European companies are not finding China so favorable or not fashionable enough? Do you think there is opportunity? Are we doing the right thing in trying to chase companies out of the US and Europe to come into India to manufacture because we have a huge domestic market and a great potential for export and skilled labor available?
Well, if I tell everybody to go to India, then everybody will go there, and then I'll have more competition. So please don't go to India. It's not a good place to invest. No, the truth is, my own firm and many other firms like mine have begun to invest significant amounts in India. And as you probably know, more money is now being invested in India by private equity firms than is being invested in China, at least Western private equity firms. India is a place where we've made a fair amount of money, and we're going to put more money in. It's a complicated place. It's not as easy to invest in as you might know. And while many people in India speak English and fewer people speak English in China, in many ways it's easier to do business in China in some ways because one central government can set certain rules and so forth. But I do think India is the next great so-called emerging market. I hate to use the word emerging market because it really has emerged. It's the third or fourth biggest economy in the world, or it will be in my lifetime. So I think it's a terrific place in which to invest, but you need to have people on the ground who know what they're doing, know what industries you're investing in, know the rules of the laws and so forth, because it can be very complicated in different areas of India. But I do think it's a place more and more Americans are going to invest in compared to China.
Thank you, sir.
Hi, my name's Paul Robinson. I run an investment fund called Equity, and we do environmental, social governance investment linked with impact investment. And the foundation of the firm is really based around a belief that how we deploy capital shapes our societies. You run investment firms, and obviously this is a narrative that's coming out now, but we still live in a world where the measurement of outcome is purely a financial number. And when you try and challenge that, it's something, well, are we going to get lower returns? But do you think there should be, and do you see a movement to a better measurement of our deployments of capital?
Okay, so in the business world, we have this wonderful mechanism called profit. And you can use profit to say you're doing well or not doing well, and obviously it doesn't measure every part of a business, but generally if you're profitable, you know you're doing better. If you're not profitable, as a general rule of thumb, sometimes new companies are unprofitable and they turn out to be profitable. In the impact that you're going to have on society is not as readily measured, but there are ways to measure, but not as readily measured as profit and loss. There are three schools of thought on this. For those who aren't that familiar with impact investing. Impact investing basically means you're going to invest and try to have a desirable social impact. Improve the environment, improve diversity, improve education, other kinds of things. Some people have the view that impact investing means, by definition, you're not investing in everything you could otherwise invest in, so you're going to have a lower rate of return because you're precluding some opportunities that you would otherwise put your money in. Other people have the view that you're going to have a higher rate of return because in the end, the world is going to say, I want to invest only in or do business only with companies that are doing good things for the society. And then there's the other school of thought say it doesn't make that much difference because it's not that measurable. I think in the next 10 or 15 years, we'll come up with a better way to measure impact so that there's some, in effect, ratio or some number which you can use just the way you do in let's say, other kinds of business areas. You have profit loss, you have earnings per share, many different things. We don't have quite that same numerical indicia that's readily accepted in impact investing, but it's clearly going to happen, and it's already happening. And as you saw from Larry Fink's statement the other day, he and others are beginning to make the effort that they don't want to really invest in people who aren't being serious about doing something to help, in that case, the environment, but there are other ways you can do impact related. Now, your firm was started by, when did you start it?
2000, and we built a previous business that was a bottled water business where you get 100% of profit from clean drinking water. But this is a business model built around Adam Smith's self-interest, really. That
Right.
You get better returns because it's a source of output through the ESG, but the informal economy gets left
Right.
behind because of O-ring effects. So we build a bridge, lift people's
Right.
sustainable livelihood, strengthen the economy. So my point would be that the financial return, yes, you get
Right.
that, but there is a broader societal
Right.
return, and you need to
Yes.
recognise what the business is feeding on and strengthen it.
The biggest source of capital for many private equity investors over the years has been either U.S. pension funds or global pension funds or endowment or sovereign wealth funds. Those professionals who invest there are often incented to meet a benchmark to measure their success by what the IRR is of what they invest in. And they don't yet get their measurement or their bonuses dependent on how the impact investing is done for the companies in which they invest. And if they could marry up the rate of return with impact investing and give professionals a higher bonus if they do a good impact investing, even if the return is slightly lower, you'll get a lot more money flowing into this area.
Stephen Ball. Hi, David. Lovely to see you. And anyone who hasn't read David's book, American History, it's amazing. Go out and buy it immediately.
Thank you, and he's getting a little royalty for that. No, actually, on my book, all the proceeds are going to literacy.
So, David, we've known each other for 25 years. What do you wish that you had known 25 years ago that you know now?
Well, two things for sure. When my daughter was an undergraduate at Harvard, she met a young man, and she's now married to him. They have 2 children. But at the time, he wanted to impress me, and he knew I was in the investment business. So he said, my classmate from Phillips Exeter and Harvard is dropping out, starting a company, looking for some cash. Would you like to invest in it? I said, what does it do? He says, kind of online dating. I said, those companies never work. That was Facebook. So the first 10 million is probably worth 30 billion. And then there was another thing I wish I had done. A young man showed up at one of our companies. We own a company called Baker & Taylor, the second biggest book distributor in the United States. Started in 1839, hadn't made a profit since 1839. It was always break even. And he was apparently starting a company to sell books over the internet, whatever the internet was. And so he wanted the bibliography of books to be able to do this, and he said he would give us a third of the company he was starting in order to get this off the ground. And we said, look, we're too smart for that. We don't want a third of a startup company. Give us some cash. So I think we got $100,000 a year. And then eventually I said after a couple of years, you know, maybe this company's worth a little bit more to us than $100,000 a year. So I went out to see Jeff Bezos, and I said, you know, that 1/3 of the company deal, I think I'll take that now. He said, well, David, we started the company 2.5 years ago. We don't need you so much, but I will give you some stock. He gave us some stock, and that stock today is worth $4 billion. We sold it for $80 million at the IPO. So I wish I'd known that everything over the internet was going to do so well. So those are some of the things. I guess I also would, you know, if I could live my life over again, I wish I had exercised more so I'd be in better shape. I wish I had, you know, visited some place I haven't visited. I wish I had spent more time with my children. They don't ever say they wish that was the case, and so, you know, lots of things I wish I could do over again. But generally, I look at many people in the world and I say, I'm very, very lucky. Look how lucky I got. So I'm 70. My classmates, I often read their obituaries. When I was growing up, my parents used to read the obituaries every day. So what are you doing that for? You know, we want to see who died. Did we know? I said, I didn't care about that when I'm 15 or 16 years old. Now I read the obituaries first every day because many of my friends are dying. And you kind of say to yourself, you may have the same experience. I'm 70, somebody 68 just died. How come I'm luckier than that person? And if somebody just dies, you know, the other day, somebody just died sadly, 71 years old. He was playing the guitar at a concert, and he just fell asleep. And I'm afraid that I might be in this beach right here. And all of a sudden, I could just fall asleep, and that's it. So plenty of things I wish I could do over, but you can't live your life over again. And I don't know whether there's reincarnation or not, and I don't know what I'm going to come back at, but I'd like to maybe come back as, you know, somebody who made the right decisions on Bill Gates' investment or Jeff Bezos, or just somebody who was seen as having done something useful for society. And let me answer it this way. In 1888, in Stockholm, there was a man sitting down to have breakfast. And he was reading the obituaries, and he read his own obituary. It's very hard to read your own obituary. Obviously, you're not dead. It was Alfred Nobel. And in fake news, in effect then, Ludwig Nobel, his younger brother, had died, and the newspaper got it wrong. So he's sitting there and he's reading this thing, and it says, the man who invented dynamite, the merchant of death, he's gone. Thank God he's gone. And he realized he hadn't done enough to give back to society, so he then came up with the Nobel Prize and so forth. So I always say to people, think about this. If your obituary was going to be published tomorrow, would you be happy with what's in there? And if you had a chance to write it yourself, what would you write about yourself? And if you have 10 more or 15 or 20 more years to live, how would you want that obituary to be different than it is likely to be today? And so those are things to think about, because Ludwig Nobel's death enabled his brother to do something that has obviously had an impact on the world, the Nobel Prizes.
So I'll come back to Tassos Economou. I'll come back to a comment you made in the beginning about YPO. A few years back, I went to Patrick Seward, and I told him I'd really like to work with Carlyle. Clearly, I didn't impress him, so I said, what can I do, what can I do? So I worked very hard with YPO, and effectively, and eventually I got elected chairman. So there's always hope that this could happen with you. Just keep trying.
Well, he asked me to speak. You have a global conference, I guess, and I spoke at one in Dubai. I think
yes, I was there. We went.
Okay, so I spoke at that one in Dubai, and you know, it was fun. And even after that speech, which apparently was well regarded, I still didn't get invited to join YPO. So
we're on it. We're on it. My question to you is, given what you said about the time, right? That effectively the one commodity that's finite is time, and the fact that YPO has this global footprint, it wants to be impactful, and it really wants to help. What is the advice and/or practical things we could do? Because advice, you know, is a lot of talk, but what could we do to really start affecting things and making change?
Well, it's hard for me to tell an organization that's been around for such a long time and to tell the chairman what to do, since I'm not even a member of the organization, have never been invited to be, but I'll give you my view. Obviously, YPO was originally set up many years ago to enable young you know, business leaders to get together for, I think, networking purposes and maybe to help the businesses more than to help society. And as the world of business has changed and it's recognized that businesses have social responsibility, I think that YPO chapters should, in my view, adopt a project or projects, but things that you can get your hands around. Saying you're going to do good for society is hard to get your hands around, but adopt one or two things. And I would say it doesn't have to be climate change because everybody has that. Find something. I mentioned literacy. It could be literacy. It could be other things, and have an impact. And I've observed over the years that if you do 20 things reasonably well, you get less attention and maybe less impact than if you do one thing very well. So if you pick one really big project and you make it your own, in a year or two, everybody in the world will say, well, YPO, they stand for literacy, or they stand for, some other project, whatever it might be. So I would try to find one big project and try to get most of your YPO chapters to adopt it as something they think is useful to do in addition to some other things they might do.
And maybe the last question, because we're running out of time.
Most valuable thing we're running out of. So anybody going to the University of Chicago thing? I'm going to that. I got to go lead that soon. And then anybody going to the Harvard one? I'm leading that. So I'm going to do that. So I have to finish soon. But I just say
Thank you so much for
my pleasure,
doing
and thanks
this.
for the
Thank
great
you.
job you're doing. And
Thank you so much.
Marcel, where's Marcel? Is Marcel?
He's gone,
He's gone.
to work.
Okay. Thank you all very much.